Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for being present in this rather technical conference, but it is appropriate in these series of conference to have come to Professor Jenkins because he's a scholar who really makes a leap forward in research. Stephen Jenkins is a professor of at London School of Economics. He took a PhD in the UK and he now teaches at London School. Now, Professor Jenkins' studies mainly relate to a very important and interesting aspect, that is social mobility and disequalities that are two interconnected aspects translate into unfair conditions, which is morally unacceptable, but there is also a factor related to a lack of economic growth. And this is a problem which only apparently is marginal, because the lack of growth in Europe in the last 10-20 years, above all in Southern Europe, including our country, which is particularly hit by the lack of social mobility. Well, this lack of growth coincides with an increase in disequalities, social disequalities, and unequal opportunities. This is something which has very important implications which add up to the already big problem of lack of growth. And Professor Jenkins, in his studies, investigated all these aspects in order to hopefully be able to find a solution. Lack of growth is #1 problem in Europe, and even in terms of Greece, where there is a lot of talk about the public debt, all economists of the Eurogroup and the ministers believe that although you may restructure and relieve the debt, the Greek debt, if you don't find a mechanism in order to kick off growth, well, that debt will start to grow again. And this applies also to Italy. You know that Italy has a strong manufacturing industry, which is the one which keeps us above the waterline, and which guarantees some growth for the future. But there are countries where the manufacturing industry is not so strong as in Italy. Now, it's important to remove, as far as possible, disequalities, and we should have a certain level of social mobility. Now, Professor Jenkins, you prepared a lecture, and you will share with us your study, and then I see that there are many young people here. There will be questions. So, Professor Jenkins, you have the floor.
Hello. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for all coming along. It's pretty scary having so many of you out there. I've been given two important instructions. The first is that I have to speak into the microphone. Luckily, I like gelati. But if I do not speak into the microphone, start waving your hands. The second thing is that I am enjoined to speak slowly, particularly for the translators, but it's probably a good thing for you as well, probably a good thing for me. But that aside, so again, there are two reasons why you may start waving your hands. The third reason may be when you hear my arguments, but we'll come to, you have your chance at the end to ask questions. So my general topic is to say what is happening to social mobility and why do we care? And I'm going to talk about this topic in 4 areas. I'm going to build an argument in 4 steps. The first one is about why we actually care, and here I'm going to rehearse the enduring policy interest in social mobility. And I'm going to remind you that virtually all the people who say that social mobility is a good thing refer to the principle of equality of opportunity. Less often, but quite often, they also refer to more social mobility being associated with more economic efficiency. So, there are good reasons, it appears, for being interested in social mobility. Then I want to take you second to headline findings. And I'm referring to them as headline findings because they are headlines. I haven't found many headlines for Italy, but I'm going to refer mostly to the US and to the UK. But the lesson is that there are numbers out there that are being used to support the arguments that are referring to why we care. Those are the evidence. And it's about differences across country. It's about trends over time. But then I want to thirdly step back and ask how you should assess those findings. Should we take them as gospel? Okay, maybe I said headline findings. We have a journalist here. Do we trust all we read in the news? That is essentially the questions I'm going to be asking. So maybe this is the academic in me coming out. What I'm going to concentrate on this talk is not giving you the answers, but providing you with a set of questions with some background. So section 4 is going to be bringing those things all together after having talked about some of the problems that refer to measurement issues, concepts, and so on. So questions. So the first area I'm going to talk about, first block, is why we care. And the interest here is very much in a range of countries. I haven't found many for Italy, but then I don't speak Italian. So, and I'm going to focus on UK, US, and international examples, and just convince you or remind you of the things that you already know about the interest in social mobility, that phrase. I want to start with the UK. It's where I currently live. And what I'm going to do here is illustrate that regardless of whether you're on the left or the right, everybody agrees that social mobility is a good thing. This is a snapshot from a document that was produced by the policy unit of Tony Blair's New Labour government by a guy called Aldridge. And in this document, it's about social mobility. It states that answers the question why social mobility is important. And here are the headings you might expect. It's important because equality of opportunity is important, and the idea is that if you don't have social mobility, you don't have equality of opportunity. Moreover, we want to make the best use of everybody's talents, and if we don't have social mobility, it is thought we don't have that. And moreover, there's this idea about social mobility enhancing social cohesion and social inclusion. So that's the New Labour government. We step forward, and here we have an all-parliamentary group. So this is the left and the right, all together in one particular group. And you'll note that there are truths about social mobility. And there it is in 2 big buttons why mobility matters: fairness and efficiency in red, or orange and red. And they mentioned equality of opportunity. They mention optimal deployment of resources. And in fact, they even put 4 percentage points of GDP growth, a big number, as being associated with the potential loss associated with not having equality of opportunity. We step forward further in history, not quite till today. This is the coalition government. We're moving further to the right. But the coalition government actually also stood up for equality of opportunity and social mobility. As it says here in the extract, the true test of fairness is the distribution of opportunities. That's why improving social mobility is the principal goal of the coalition government's social policy. So this is the left and the right. Nick Clegg is no longer in the government. He lost they lost badly, but the government has not thrown away social mobility yet. There is a Social Mobility and Child Poverty Commission. And what it set up, this was set up by the government, is to look at measures to improve social policies, to social mobility. So in the UK, this is big stuff. It is also very big in the USA. Interestingly, this is not coming from the social policy area. This guy, Alan Kruger, is the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. And in 2012, he talked about the relationship between income mobility and income inequality, that is, the dispersion in incomes at any particular time. But he was saying that and you might be willing to trade off more inequality if there was more mobility. And he associates these things, he's pointing out that as inequality has increased, the evidence suggests that year to year or generation to generation economic mobility has decreased, a problem. And we'll come back to him because he christened something called the Great Gatsby Curve. And I'm going to show you a picture of that curve later on. We move further forward, and again, from what you might think of as the social policy arena, this is the American equivalent of the president of the Banca d'Italia, the chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, macroeconomist, no less. They're bothered about inequality and its relationship to mobility, talking about diminished intergenerational mobility, and talking about, in these circumstances, society faces difficult questions of how to best, to fairly and justly promote equality of opportunity. Those words again, equality of opportunity, social mobility, they're joined together. It's not just Janet, it's her boss. Barack Obama has made speeches about these sorts of things. In this talk, he links together equality of opportunity, outcomes, and so on, the same sorts of things that Alan Kruger was talking about. And note that he talks about the combined trends of increased inequality and decreasing mobility pose no less a fundamental threat to the American dream. So keep this in mind. Remember, America is the land of equality of opportunity, the dream. Remember that when I show you some pictures later on. Okay, very quickly, it's not just in the US and the UK. You can find European examples. The EU has a document that refers to fostering social mobility as a contribution to social cohesion. The OECD, this is interesting. This is a document about growth. It is called Going for Growth. But what's Chapter 5 about? Chapter 5 is about intergenerational social mobility. Why? Because it talks about more mobility is fostering economic growth. Similarly, the World Bank is interested in this, and there is a well-known report by 3 authors talking about these issues, and I'm a little nervous because one of the authors is sitting in the front row. And the World Bank has also been extending these ideas to other areas outside the OECD, to Latin America, the Caribbean, and so on. So this is big stuff, interest around the world. So, to summarize so far, we do care about social mobility, and the way in which it is normally stated is that we think that more mobility means more equality of opportunity, and we think that more mobility will foster economic efficiency. But that then, of course, raises the question, what's the problem? How much social mobility is there, in fact? Okay, before answering that question, giving you some headline findings, a little diversion, because I have to explain how people measure it. And I think what you may be intrigued by is that everybody is doing it in the same way, but you may be rather interested or surprised in the one particular measure that they have focused on. So first of all, you have to choose what you're thinking about mobility of. Now, I'm going to be talking about social mobility, but what that actually means typically is income mobility. Well, actually, it's often not income mobility, but earnings mobility. That is, among the mobility of people, their labor earnings among people who have a job. And so it's not this is not taking into account social security benefits, it's not pooling husbands and wives' incomes, and so on. It's talking about men, employed men. Women are out of the picture most of the time. Thirdly, it's typically income is measured not using lifetime income, because we don't measure lifetime income typically. The problem, a really serious problem, is that we have snapshots from people's lives rather than movies of their income. So we have to make inferences from snapshots, and economists have spent a lot of time trying to work out how to do this and particular problems, perhaps spent too much time on it. There are two particular problems. One is to do with measurement errors that come from having only short observations within people's life cycles, so-called transitory variation. And another issue is life cycle bias. This is the idea that essentially if you want to compare the life chances of parents and children, you want to measure them at comparable stages of the life cycle. Suppose you have a father at the age of around about the age of 40. It's no good measuring the son's life chances at the age of 15 or indeed 20, because things happen thereafter. There is systematic relationship. So there is these issues. So that's, in fact, it's not income mobility or social mobility more generally. It's earnings, it's men, and it's this particular measure, annual earnings. But then, how is mobility summarized? Let me tell you about something called beta. Okay, I'm going to try and summarize some econometrics in a picture. That may be a vain hope, but I'm going to try. So, on the right-hand side, ladies and gentlemen, we have a picture, and it's summarizing on the horizontal axis father's income. So this is the parent's generation. And in fact, because we're interested in proportional differences, it's measured using a transformation called the logarithm. But essentially, the further you go along to the right, the higher father's income is. And where the vertical line intersects is going to tell us about mean income. Also, in the vertical direction, we have son's income, again measured relative to the mean. So what that means is that we have example data. I don't know if you can see very well, but there are lots of grey dots there. And that is a combination, if we go out and have a survey, of observations on father's incomes, father's earnings and son's earnings. And you can see there are splodges all over the place. So somehow we've got to summarize all these different observations. So how do we do it? So economists like regression, linear regression. I don't want to try and explain that, but the idea is relatively simple. And it is to think about what is the expected differences for people who have got fathers with different circumstances. Just imagine that if every son's earnings was the same as their father's earnings in expectation, that would mean that everything relative to the mean, that everybody would lie on this 45-degree line. Okay, so that's put another way. If you were to try and fit a line through all those dots, the slope of that line would be equal to 1. So that's one extreme where if a father's income is twice the mean, and that's where I've got a point here, then the son's income would be expected to be twice the mean. Another extreme would be where there would be absolutely no relationship between son's income and father's income. In that particular case, we take this line down, and it would be lying on this horizontal axis. That is the other extreme. The slope of the line is 0. Beta is 0. Now, in between, when we fit the line to the reality out there, we have lines of different slope. So beta is the slope of this line, and the issue is, does it lie between here and does it lie between there? Sounds fairly complicated. It's really nice. Economists love it. It's one number. Summarizes everything, and it has these nice two extremes. So another way of thinking about it is in terms of transition matrices. What does that mean? Oh, sounds horrible. It's a very simple idea. We line everybody up in the father's generation from poorest to richest and split that population into equal-sized groups. Let's say 5 groups, so-called quintile groups. Then we do the same for the son's generation. Line them up from poorest to richest. Split them into 5 groups. And then we can cross-tabulate origins against destinations and see the extent to which people's origins tally with their destinations. To what extent, if the chance, what are the chances of people who start out at the bottom, for example, ending out in different places? Well, that sounds rather abstract, but let's look at Italy. Here's an example I did find for Italy about these sorts of things. So, whoops, sorry. So here are 5 groups. This is from the poorest fifth through to the richest fifth of sons in Italy at this particular time. Here is the same for the fathers. So this is the origin generation. This is the destination. And you might ask then, what are the chances of people starting out at the bottom reaching different destinations from the poorest fifth to the richest fifth? And the issue is, if everybody was stuck in the same place, that is totally deterministic position, this is like the beta equals 1 position, then this proportion here, the fraction of those who start out in this group ending up, where do they end up? If that was equal to 1, that means they're all stuck there. Indeed, you can imagine if everybody was, all these entries, these row proportions were equal to 1, then that's the no mobility reference point. On the other hand, if where you ended up was independent of your origins, all these entries here would be 20%, 0.20. The reality is somewhere in between. So what we see, for example, for Italy is that of those starting in the poorest fifth, you can see around almost a third of them stay in the poorest fifth, and only just over 10% make it up to the richest fifth. If we go to the other extreme, you can see around of those who started off in the richest fifth, 10% stay there, but around 40% stay in the richest fifth. Now that number is, the authors from the paper I took it from remark on this as being this high persistence in the upper tail of the distribution is distinctive about Italy. And we'll come back to that because I've got more information about Italy. Okay, so now you know how economists measure mobility. In fact, they don't often use those transition matrices. They're often more sociologists who use those, but there are some about. Beta is it. So you can do econometrics now. So watch these numbers. Okay, so this is the Great Gatsby Curve. If you know the book by F. Scott Fitzgerald, you'll know why it's called the Great Gatsby Curve. On the horizontal axis, we measure income inequality. The more we move in the right-hand direction, the more the inequality in a given, the higher is inequality in a given country. The thing I've just been talking about, beta, is on the vertical direction. And this is the problem that the Alan Kruger, Janet Yellen, Barack Obama were talking about. This curve, which shows a positive relationship between inequality on the one hand and immobility of earnings on the vertical axis. And you might notice here that if we think in terms of the differences in beta, we have some of the usual suspects down here. That is, the Nordic countries are countries with low immobility, high mobility. This is in terms of beta. Then we move up to countries like the one where I was born. But look what's up at the top. And I've put a box around Italy. So Italy is a low mobility country according to this measure. And by the way, up there with Italy is the United States. Remember the land of opportunity? Okay, so this has historically been a very surprising result. This is why a lot of people are interested in it. And the UK, where I live, is also up there as well. So keep this in mind. So the big headline, the things that people talk about, are based on beta and particular measures. What about trends over time? Has it always been like this? Well, we don't have a lot of information. Why? Because it's actually quite hard to get this information. Remember, we need information about parents and about children. But we have a little bit of information. I'm not going to take you through these caterpillar plots, but they're essentially estimates from different researchers about the trend over time, horizontal axis, measuring when sons are born along the horizontal axis, and these are measures of beta. And the thing that you take away from those pictures is that the lines in the middle of each of these pictures is flat. So social mobility is not increasing or decreasing, which may be surprising, but that's how it is, the best estimates for the USA. That's men. If you look at women, apart from this old group right back here, you can see again the line is flat, the line is flat. Those are headline news. If you go to the UK, the findings about social mobility are big headlines. This is old research done almost 10 years ago, but it's still the headline, and I'll come back to why that is later. Okay, these guys wrote their own headlines in one of their papers, but you can read that, right? It's big writing. Social mobility is low, and it's falling. And just to illustrate this, I've taken some numbers, because I understand that you know about beta now. If we're focusing on sons, you can see, for example, that the estimate of beta, one of their estimates has gone from 0.2 up to 0.3 over time. So more immobility, beta has gone up, and other econometric estimates, different ways of playing with the data, show the same result. So we do care about social mobility, 1. 2, social mobility, as commonly measured, is not pervasive. We are not at the extremes. Remember, beta equals 0. Definitely not there. In fact, there's relatively low mobility in some countries, in particular the USA, the UK, and Italy. And mobility may be falling, which is definitely not what we want. So the next thing we should ask ourselves is, how do we assess these headline findings? And I'm going out on a limb here, so being a bit provocative against all this literature. So basically, how should we assess the findings? I think we should salute, because clearly a lot of work has gone into it. But at the same time, we need to be a little wary and show some caution. And I want to illustrate that argument by taking us back to thinking about how we measure mobility. And how do we measure mobility? That means going back to the concepts, what we actually mean by equality of opportunity, and how we measure equality of opportunity, and also about data. Data sounds boring, but data are important. Those headlines have come from data. So, first of all, let's think about mobility concepts and the summary mobility measures. So, in fact, there are multiple mobility concepts, and I would distinguish between at least 3, so-called positional or relative mobility, first. Secondly, absolute mobility, and a third concept which is associated with dynastic inequality reduction, but I'm not going to talk about that. I've mentioned it, but most focus is the difference between positional and absolute mobility. So, what is positional mobility, if we think about it, or relative mobility, or as sociologists have referred to it often, exchange mobility? This is a very pure kind of mobility where we're only interested in changes in people's ranks in society. It's not the income associated with that position, but the rank. And the nice thing about pure positional mobility is that it controls for the fact that there have been huge changes over time in the income distribution between parents' generations and sons' generations. Typically, we're talking about 30 to 40 years, and we know that the income distribution in many countries around the world, for example, the average has gone up, but so too has inequality in many of these countries. There's an issue about how you take account of this. The great thing about relative mobility, positional mobility, is that it's pure mobility. And it's also what many politicians sign up to as the sort of mobility we should be bothered about. One uncomfortable thing, however, for politicians is that and remember politicians like mobility, the problem is that everybody's position depends on everybody else's. So if somebody moves down from the top one slot, somebody else has to go up to take their place. Put it another way, not everybody can be upwardly mobile. And I bet you cannot find a politician who would argue in favor of downward mobility for anybody. Okay, so they subscribe to mobility of this kind, but awkwardly forget some of these problems sometimes. It's also worthwhile talking about this because the reference point that comes out from this way of looking at mobility, this particular concept, is that you have complete mobility when the destination positions are independent of parental origins. But this is what's linked to equality of opportunity, normally. Okay, now let's contrast relative mobility with absolute mobility. So here we're actually concerned with individual income growth. Has my real income level got higher than my father's? Or in fact, is it lower? Or is my chance of becoming a millionaire now higher or higher than for other people? So here is a situation where mobility is not necessarily defined relative to everybody else's. It's possibly for everybody to be upwardly mobile. And of course, the fact that average incomes have increased over time becomes really important. It's part of the measure. Well, okay, so that may be just academic playing around, but the important thing to keep in mind is that, which I summarized in detail on this slide, is if you believe in positional mobility, then you should not believe in beta. But remember, beta is what everybody uses. The problem is that beta mixes these two concepts up, okay? And there are ways of trying to control for it, but they don't do a great job. And so in fact, if you're really interested in positional mobility, I would argue that you should use measures, not beta, other ones that take account of or go to the concept directly for rank-based measures, transition matrices, and so on. But we haven't done that a lot. Why does everybody do it? Some reasons are good, some reasons not so good. Perhaps the bad one is that everybody else has done it before, and so academics are fairly conventional. They want to compare their results with other people, or maybe that's respectable. But anyway, there are various other technical reasons, some to do with addressing some of the problems that I referred to earlier that are important. But the point is, everybody still focuses on beta, at least amongst economists. Is this an important point or not? I would argue it is an important point, and I would like to illustrate it by contrasting some new results that have recently come out, which compare estimates of mobility based on beta with ones that are based on positional mobility. These are just 3 countries, Canada, Sweden and the USA, and perhaps the interesting contrast is with Sweden and the USA, because you remember that Sweden is one of the good guys in terms of beta, that is relatively high social mobility. The USA was the bad guy with low mobility. That's a new beta estimate, and you can see that beta immobility is much higher in the USA than in Sweden. But in fact, this recent research has shown that if you move to a pure rank-based measure, the rank correlations, then it turns out that Sweden and the USA have got the same amount of relative mobility. So is there a great Gatsby curve when you look at it this way? Maybe not. Okay, so there are different mobility principles. The choice of principles really matters. Here's some further evidence from the USA. I won't talk through the details, but just look at the picture and believe me. On the vertical axis, we have a measure of mobility, not beta, but a rank-based measure equivalent. And on the horizontal axis is time. And basically what you can see on that picture is that that line is flat. So interestingly, in the USA, when these guys have, Raj Chetty and colleagues have done these estimates, the estimates of rank-based mobility are constant as well. So we have these questions about the principle of how we think about mobility. Another way of thinking about mobility is that we were interested in mobility because we think beta measures equality of opportunity. And the transition matrix, this idea when beta is 0, or when the entries in the transition matrix are all equal to 0.20, 20%, then this notion of origin independence. However, John Roemer, an American economist, has sort of pointed out that the emperor hasn't got many clothes on. That, for example, the degree of origin independence is a direct and good measure of inequality of opportunity, only if two rather special conditions apply. The first condition is essentially that all parental advantage is summarized by income, or in these studies, earnings. The second one is that we're basically we're not allowing for the fact that outcomes, remember this is incomes for children, sons in particular, we're looking at our reference point is entirely in terms of parental income, family background. We're not allowing for the fact that some of the differences in the race of life depend not just on where we start, but also the amount of effort that people put in. So really, what we should perhaps do, if we're interested in measuring equality of opportunity, is that we should try and measure it directly. So that leads to a whole new area of literature by John Roemer that has led to lots of work, including by Vita Parajani here, about equality of opportunity, or its inequality of opportunity. So this literature makes a distinction between circumstances, which are the things that people cannot affect and so cannot be held responsible for in a moral sense or social justice sense. Virtually most things associated with family background. I've been talking about income, but it might not necessarily only be that. It could include things like skin color, ethnic minority group, perhaps where people live, and so on. But there is also the issue of effort. That is, things that people can affect or choose, and so they may be morally responsible for. And one key example might be here work effort in the labour market. People's earnings may differ because even if they have the same talents, some people may work harder than others. And of course, outcomes reflect basically circumstances, efforts, and policies. And John's argument is that equality of opportunity occurs if and only if the differences in the outcomes of interests, we're talking about children's incomes here, reflect differences in effort alone. Okay, so the idea is that circumstances are irrelevant. So he's trying to control for extra stuff. And I've got in the other bullet points how people have gone about trying to explain those sorts of things. I won't go through the details. What I'm going to show you, however, is a picture just to try and convince you that this approach leads to something that is different from the mainstream and headline approach. So this is drawing on a World Bank report, including some of Vito's work. There are two charts here. I'm afraid they're rather indistinct, but you may well see better on your handouts. The one on the vertical axis, at the top rather, is a measure of inequality of opportunity, defined in the particular way that they do in the study. They call it IOR. And on the horizontal axis is our friend beta. Now, if we were measuring the same things, these observations for lots and lots of different countries would all lie on a straight line. Ladies and gentlemen, do those dots all lie on a straight line? The answer is, of course, no. There is a lot of dispersion around those lines. So, bottom line, we have two different concepts here. And so the choice of how you think about your normative concepts actually matters. The other thing to take account is the second picture. Remember, the most famous graph in social mobility studies at the moment is the Great Gatsby Curve that I told you about before. This is the attempt, I'm calling it an attempt, I'm not sure the authors called it that. This is measuring income inequality on the horizontal axis. This is measuring inequality of opportunity in a Roemer sense on the vertical axis. And again, here we have all the country observations there. Do they all lie close to a straight line in the same way as the Great Gatsby Curve? Answer, no. So once we start muddying the water, asking these questions about going behind the headlines, it's not so clear. So we might say, again, picking up this theme about which mobility concept, we might ask ourselves whether or not we should look at absolute mobility more. And of course, there are various ways of doing it. And let me remind you that none of them is measured directly by beta, which is what people use. Absolute mobility may be particularly important these days, because we know this is a period where average income is not continuing to grow. As Eugenio said in his introductory remarks, economic growth is particularly important. And we know now we're in an age of the Great Recession, followed by the austerity age. We're not currently in the era of what American economists referred to as the Great Moderation that followed the post-war growth spurt. So income levels come into play, I think, very importantly. And I think it may chime in with a lot of people's views about what counts as mobility or what they're worried about, or parents and children are worried about. I'll just give you one example of this, and or two examples. This is an American example. The Pew Trust, a research organization, surveys people about income mobility and their attitudes to economic mobility. And amongst other things, they ask them about absolute mobility. And it turns out that in this particular time, what this long quotation is summarized rather shortly, briefly, says is that Americans now, a much larger proportion of Americans, are worried that their children will not be as well off as they themselves were, in an absolute sense. We're talking about real incomes. And this comes back to some of the issues that you were talking about at the beginning, Eugenio, because if you don't have economic growth, or in fact, if you're at the bottom, and we know that people in the bottom in particular are not doing particularly well, their incomes are either flat or falling over time, then you have this social mobility problem. There is also similar problems in the UK coming up. I've got a reference here to Tony Blair. Tony Blair was famously accosted in a television interview by a very aggressive interviewer called Jeremy Paxman, who was trying to get him to say whether or not it was acceptable for inequality to go up. Tony, consummate politician, of course, dodged the question, but his answer was to say that what he was interested in is increasing the incomes of everybody. He couldn't care if David Beckham's income increased a lot. The issue was essentially whether everybody's income increased a little, or it must. So absolute mobility is potentially an issue. There are also issues about whether or not we should talk about earnings versus income. I've said that was an issue. Surely we should think about wider concept than just earnings. So perhaps we should think about that. We should think about all individuals, not just men, also bring in women. So you ask yourself, are the data not out there? I would say there are data out there. We should do something. But I should also acknowledge that once you start bringing women into the picture, it becomes more difficult. And perhaps economists, to their discredit, have shied away from these sorts of difficulties. If somebody is not working in the labour market, so an unemployed man, not just a woman who is staying at home and looking after the children, their earnings are zero. And that's a problem for the way in which mobility is measured in these particular ways, and people have shied away from addressing that problem. I think it's that's a potential problem. Perhaps we should spend some time, although it's messy, and we should also investigate that problem. Does it make a difference? The answer is yes. We have old evidence about this. A study I worked on when I was doing my doctorate showed that the beta measures were, there was more mobility in terms of income than there is for earnings. Raj Chetty has also recently shown this with his colleagues for the USA. There are also issues of data. We might, you think, move to new types of data, and people are doing this increasingly in the USA. That's good advice, but not so good in countries that don't have those sort of data or don't have available sorts of data. What we can do is, of course, study the case studies that are already out there and investigate them in more detail and ask whether or not about the reliability of the headline findings. So let me take a UK case study and go back to that big headline that I talked about before. Remember, social mobility is low and may be falling. This is based on just 2 surveys, folks. So when you think about trends, you might think trends, you build up inferences from many data points. This is just 2 points, which is potentially problematic. You've got a stick clearly and you're joining up these 2 points, but I think you don't want to put too much weight on those conclusions without further checking. Moreover, if you dig a bit further in these studies, you'll find that the measures that are used for parental status and son status are not exactly the same. There are questions about the quality of the data, and I detail them in the bullet points. My point here is not to say that the researchers who did the study are bad researchers. I just think we need to be more honest and open about the fact that we don't know everything, or act as if we know everything in this area. So are the results robust? I think they're potentially sensitive. Here is one latest study that is reinvestigated it using different data, slightly different methods. And essentially what they have here is a row of estimates of beta. They've gone from 2 to many. And essentially this is evidence that's consistent with the earlier study. Okay, maybe I was being too harsh. It's by my former colleagues at the University of Essex, essentially showing this is beta. And you can see that it's been constant. This is essentially what Blanden and colleagues were showing. And then this beta rising, mobility, this is the same period that Blanden and others were talking about. So if you take this particular approach, you appear to get evidence that is consistent. Okay, they were economists. What happens if you wheel on the sociologists? Okay, to be fair, remember they're talking about something different. They're talking about social class mobility. But you might expect that because social class is measured in terms of occupational hierarchies, and we know that earnings are closely related to occupational position, you might expect that there would be some sort of form of consistency in terms of the results. And John Goldthorpe and others has essentially argued and used lots of data that has got multiple data points, is basically argued that there is not evidence for the Blanden and others' claim that mobility is falling in the UK. They're not saying it's rising, they're simply saying that the case that it's falling has not yet been made convincingly. And they try and explore the reasons for why their results differ. And there are detailed technical arguments about the way in which earnings differ within occupations and the extent to which that dispersion of earnings has changed over time, that is, between generations. And they construct a story to explain why their results differ from Blanden and others, and implicitly argue their results are more reliable. Of course, the original researchers do not take that lying down. They fight back, and in a recent article in the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society, they dismiss the sociologist's argument. I can't say who's a winner yet because they're still fighting. But what I want to leave you with is this issue that we need to be cognizant of the potential result that, results are not always clear-cut, they're not always robust. And I have a second Italian example here. It's rather old data, actually produced by two sociologists and about mobility in Italy. And this is essentially a measure of association between occupational position of fathers and sons. It's a bit like kappa. Their measure is a bit like beta. And it's going down, 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 but very slightly. And these are measures of our statistical confidence in the results. So essentially, the point estimates suggest that there has been a slight increase in social or occupational class mobility for men, but we have no evidence, comparable evidence for income or earnings or occupation. So again, all the issues that I was raising for Britain, I think you should probably also be asking in Italy as well. We may well agree that that social mobility is relatively low in Italy, but there are questions about its trends. There are also arguments about the relationships between Germany and the USA, but I'll skip that in the interests of time. So I've now got to my fourth step. So I've been building up my argument by saying that there is a lot of interest in social mobility, with appeals made to the principles of equality of opportunity and economic efficiency. But I've stirred the mud, and I want these are potentially questions that we can answer, discuss amongst ourselves. What really are the links between mobility and the underlying moral or normative principles that we're really interested in? And what is the interest in particular, the relationship in particular, for example, between social mobility, equality of opportunity, and the more recent measures of equality of opportunity that have been argued for by John Roemer? My second point was that there are lots of headline findings out there about mobility, about differences across countries, and about mobility levels. And they're often taken as gospel, certainly in Britain and the USA, at least in the public arena and by politicians, but they deserve scrutiny. And I've given various reasons. They're to do with how we summarize mobility, what is the appropriate mobility concept, who should be included in the analysis. Indeed, how should we summarize life chances in terms of income, earnings, social class, or what? What are the relationships between these measures? And of course, if we want to derive robust conclusions, we need good data sets, and that's important as well. So overall, I would say that we've made a lot of progress in the study of social mobility over the last few decades. We know a lot more about some countries than others, and you can see that in my focus on the US and the UK. I found a couple of Italian examples, but there are relatively few, and not many about other countries. So there's still much to learn. As Danish philosopher Piet Hein said, problems worthy of attack prove their worth by hitting back. Thank you.
Che dire, innanzitutto grazie per questo discorso e grazie soprattutto per il fatto, come dire.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you so much for working on these issues, central issues indeed. And the work of professors like Jenkins actually consoles us because they really explore in depth such dramatic and urgent issues. The fact that in Italy there is an issue of social mobility is evident to everybody. It is the land of relations, and also in America, the fact that the American dream is a failure. Well, this is evident. We saw the images on TV of Ferguson and other riots. Well, a bit more surprising is the UK, and this perhaps comes from the old issue of lords, aristocracy, and the differentiation into different backgrounds. So it's really current problems, and we don't have countries such as Russia and Qatar in these diagrams, where probably there are issues of social inequality. Now, what I'd like to ask Jenkins before turning to the audience is the following question. Well, we have seen in your speech that many scholars, many economists work on the problem. And even very popular people, Jenkins quoted Obama, Blair, the chairperson of the Federal Reserve, who, as a woman, certainly experienced some forms of discrimination. So you see, people who have the power, who should have the power to solve these problems, perhaps there is a fear to limit privileges or touch privileges. Why do you think people, also powerful people, cannot face these problems and solve these problems? And in Europe, don't you think that Europe could take some initiative in order to reduce disequalities and increase social mobility?
Thank you very much for the questions. Essentially, the first question is about politicians and why, how they operate in relation to social mobility. The first thing, of course, is that no politician would ever say that they are against social mobility. Okay? We all agree that it's a good thing. And, of course, that gets them a long way. As I've tried to explain, social mobility is a rather vague concept in terms of making it concrete. For less scrupulous politicians, that, of course, is very convenient. They don't have to do very much. But that's perhaps a slur on politicians. Remember, for example, the British New Labour government that came in with Tony Blair was seriously intending to try and do something about social mobility, and that means they redirected a lot of attention to helping families, families with children in particular. And that, is if the problem is in the home, then help families, and they did a lot. But here comes to the second problem for politicians and assessing what's going on, is that we're talking about social mobility is something that takes place across generations. A generation is a long time. Again, politicians work to short-term timetables, and that often clearly the benefits of making investments in children and families take a long time to come off. There are early signals that we may look at, for example, the extent to which family background difference is in achievement early in primary school or in secondary school or entry to the labour market may provide us with early evidence about what's going to happen, but it's not the evidence. The problem is, so again, the long-term nature of the problem stops people doing it. And I guess there is also a third problem, and that is priorities. And we all agree that social mobility is a noble aim, but so too is increasing economic health at a particular time, or a return to growth. And right at the moment, after the financial crisis, the Great Recession, governments are very concerned about fixing growth, getting the economy back on track, rather than perhaps long-term solutions. So, 3 reasons.
Il ruolo dell'Europa quale potrebbe essere?
And what about the possible role of Europe? Because everybody says that Europe should be a place where problems are solved and not created, and yet it seems that the opposite occurs, and that only problems are created in Europe. So Europe perhaps should do more for social mobility. What do you think about it? Or do you think it's difficult?
Yes, it's definitely difficult, but maybe I'm more optimistic than you are. In the sense of, well, remember, I live in a country that is about to have a vote on whether or not to stay in. The answer is yes, of course, we've got to stay in. But the issue, remember that politicians are, in terms of not just concrete policies and doing things, they're in the business of changing minds. And one of the important things that we know about the Millennium Goals is that it helped concentrate the mind on poverty around the world. Whether or not it's led to concrete actions, another story, but it's helped contrast the mind, focus the mind. Similarly, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown in New Labour stood up near the beginning of their first government and said, we're going to abolish child poverty, get rid of it totally. Stupid politicians to make such a big claim. But on the other hand, it changed the nature of the game. This is aspirational politics that really set out the goals. Now we come back to Europe, which is what you asked about. Remember that there are Europe 2020 objectives. Now, it's true that social mobility is not of the short list of objectives for Euro 2020. Poverty reduction is, however, one of them. But I'm perhaps more optimistic that one thing that could be done at the European level is to change the nature of debates. And these nature of the debates are going to become increasingly urgent as we move further into this austerity age.
Alzare il livello del dibattito perché bisogna in qualche modo cominciare a parlare di cosa potrebbe fare l'Europa.
This means that we should start talking about what Europe can do, not only in defensive terms, but also in proactive terms and in constructive terms. So we open the floor to questions now.
Professor Jenkins, you made a very convincing case about difficulties in measuring social mobility.
Forse è il caso che lei parli in italiano, le dispiace se la traducono per lui, per il pubblico, è giusto parlare in italiano.
Please speak in Italian and it will be translated into English so that the rest of the audience can also understand. My question is, you offered us a very interesting overview of the debate about social mobility, and you evidenced how difficult it is to measure it in a reliable way. My question is whether, theoretically speaking, you think that social mobility promotes economic efficiency or not. So let's assume that we have a better and bigger social mobility. Would that contribute to economic growth or not?
Yes.
Thank you.
So we're returning to big picture questions. So I'll give you a big picture answer. And of course, the difficulty is making that concrete. So how do we actually do it? And the interesting thing about Stephen Aldridge's quotation that I gave you right at the very beginning is that the Cabinet Office policy unit that he belonged to had developed these estimates of how it can be done. So it is possible to provide estimates of the gains that could be done from social mobility. Of course, and similarly from equality of opportunity, it's quite hard to do. And again, the results are probably, you take them with a grain of salt. But yes, we could calculate these things. I think the problem is not at the level of the general arguments. I think, as I said before, I think we possibly all agree with them. The difficulty is making them concrete and coming up with robust answers first, and secondly, being very clear about the different sorts of concepts that we're interested in. Thank you.
Del resto, permettete di passare il microfono, giustamente.
And I would add that Stephen examines the problem, studies the problem, then it is up to politicians and to those who work on the field to implement the outcomes of the theoretical research, thanks also to exact measures. Professor Jenkins,
in questi giorni diversi relatori
in the past days, several speakers underlined the need to place education and social state at the very center of the political agenda. And of course, this entails a number of costs and expenses. Do you think that the tax commitments, so to say, that have been made and that derive from being part of the fiscal compact and the pact for growth, do you think that they are compatible with the overall aim that we said, or are they too big constraints?
Yes, clearly, if governments sign up to austerity packages, either by lowering spending or increasing taxes, then that is a big constraint. On the other hand, there are always choices. And so the question is not just about the levels of taxes or spending, of different types of spending. There is choices about the structure of that spending. And so, for example, in the UK, the Labour government introduced policies such as an educational maintenance allowance, which was to promote staying on at school. And that was removed by the coalition government, who substituted something in its place that was, I think, not quite as adequate. So, but it's there is an example of choice. So, again, I refer to in terms of policies that promote equality of opportunity, might devote resources to children, right? So early, broadly speaking, early years investments, which may be in education, but generally preschool, families, and those sorts of things. Again, that's a choice. Even if the amount that you're taking from taxes going on, there's still a choice about whether or not you put it into pensions, the health service, or this. So there are choices to be made. More pessimistically, I'm not sure that those policies, at least speaking about Britain, those choices are going to be made. We shall see. The current government, for example, has just announced that, or recently announced that it's going to be extending the amount of free or subsidised childcare, and on top of what already exists, and which you might think of as a equality of opportunity promoting policy, but it's unclear yet. We don't have the details whether or not that will actually do it. And there are already people saying that it's not funded particularly well. So again, money matters, but I think choices also matter.
Del resto, che sia una questione di scelte.
It is a question of choices, and Mr. Cottarelli said that yesterday here in Trento. He said he was the Commissioner for Spending Review. He was called Mr. Katz. And he said that it's not just a question of curbing, of cutting. You have to make choices because some things have to be reinforced, and that is education, training, research, university. And as Professor correctly said, education in general, this is what we have to head to. I have a more technical and abstract question in terms of the philosophy of knowledge. If I understood correctly, the message of your contribution is that social mobility is a very important topic. We have to be concerned about it, we have to care for it, but we also know very little about it. We have contrasting approaches to that, so much so that you ended your contribution opening up a number of questions about the measurement of social mobility itself. With the person sitting next to me, we were discussing about it and said that conceptual schemes contribute to creating the reality that we want to describe, which is constructed based on those conceptual schemes. Now, the core of my question is, this conception, this concept, which is a bit confused of social mobility that we have, doesn't it derive from the lack of dialogue between different disciplines, say economics and sociology, so that there are different and separate approaches? But you quoted a number of sociologists, and results there have been compared, but it is difficult still to elaborate a common language that we can use for communication purposes among ourselves and among different disciplines.
Yes, that's true. But actually, the field of social mobility is probably a lot better than many other fields in terms of its dialogue between different groups. I'm privileged. I'm married to a sociologist, so it's we talk. But the serious point is, you gave a rather pessimistic description, I think, about the interchange between disciplines, and to some extent, I would agree that there are many areas where economists and other disciplines don't talk. This is probably one of the better ones, actually, because there are, for example, there are, in terms of concrete evidence, in terms of data, there aren't a lot out there, so everybody's beginning to use the same sorts of information. You may be intrigued by the fact that last year in the American Economic Review published some papers by leading sociologists on intergenerational social mobility over a couple of centuries. So there are dialogues. I mean, it's always going to be the case that people will look at these things differently. I find it rather interesting, in fact, that at least in the British context, that there is now a group of sociologists and a group of economists who are having this dialogue. Okay, they talk past each other a little, but they're at least shouting at each other, which is a good start, and we're making progress. I mean, it really is interesting to know about the relationship between occupational social class and hierarchies, and how that relates to earnings and income. I mean, I think now I'm more positive than you are.
Del resto ci sono anche I gruppi di studio.
There are also study groups and set up by the OECD and the World Bank, for instance, and normally they are multidisciplinary. Isn't it so, Stephen? They include economists, psychologists, sociologists, mathematicians for the statistical part. So really the effort goes in the direction of being multidisciplinary now. Is there an additional question?
Il microfono? No, guarda, arriva. Eccolo lì. Sì, prego. Poi dopo. Sì.
No concepts.
Salve. Lei ha detto
Hello. You convincingly said that a larger social mobility would promote or facilitate growth. But it's not clear to me what is the basic intuition at the basis of this notion. So from the theoretical viewpoint, how would you explain this correlation between social mobility and economic growth? Thank you.
Okay, it's a very simple idea, not one that is particularly well filled out. But the idea is that everybody is talented in different sorts of ways. If we do not use everybody's talents, including those from lower family backgrounds, however measured, then we're wasting talent. That is the short answer. That's as far as it goes. Now, of course, to make it more concrete and to come back to the situation that we were talking about in answer to the question before, then you have to start getting much more precise. And to be honest, I don't know how they did their calculation, but that's the direction of travel. So you look at the gradients, the differences by different social groups in terms of educational achievement, and starting from a situation where you believe that, say, all children have the same intrinsic talent, you just need to nurture that talent. And we know that there are differences, and if you were to bring them up to the same, then that will have knock-on effects. We know about rates of return to education and so on and so forth. That's the way in which the calculations are done.
Anche perché credo, Stephen, parlando
Also because, as a journalist, I can say that if there is more upward mobility, well, you try to increase also the earnings, and so taxes will be higher. And then with a better education, with better educational attainments, people will have better paid jobs, which will create wealth. Perhaps they will set up their own businesses. So it's a virtuous circle which aims at growth. Well, if you think about that, I don't know, Stephen, if I'm saying something stupid, but that's the reason why we say that when a country gets old, it gets impoverished, not because old people are bad, but because there is a failure of new initiatives, for example.
One way of interpreting what you said is that if everybody's income levels go up, that's a good thing. And of course, that's absolute mobility. Yeah. The problem is whether or not everybody's maintaining the same relative position or not. And one of the consequences that has been much described more by sociologists than by economists is that the fact that those who are several rungs up the ladder want to stay there. And if education is one of the key routes for social mobility getting on, then middle and upper class parents are going to do their damnedest to keep their children in good education and maintain those positions. So if I were to turn pessimist for a moment, then one interpretation of what you said is that it depends where the money is going, and if it's in different parts of the distribution, if better off parents are doing well and better than the people at the bottom and would like to move those resources into maintaining their position, it doesn't necessarily have a good effect on social mobility and the chances of those at the bottom. It's not necessarily that everybody will gain. So again, it comes back to these concepts.
Si spera magari che comincia a fare assunzioni, comincia a assumere anche i più poveri.
Well, perhaps they can recruit poor people, unemployed people. Well, anyway. I have a question. Now, when we look at reality, reality is one, but then the viewpoints or the patterns that we use are different. And you said that we must be cautious because the approach should consider the income, men, women. Well, apart from the issue of other parameters, the issue of wealth meant in a broader sense, I think that wealth could have an influence there. What can you tell us?
I can tell you that I left that out by mistake. Well, I should have mentioned at the beginning. In shortening my slides, the number of slides that I had, I removed a slide. Well, that's my excuse. No, wealth, after all, we've had Thomas Piketty here this week as well, who reminds us that wealth is very important. I was talking about income. You have very correctly reminded us that it's not just income, but also the stock of assets that people have, which is very important. And moreover, it's not only financial wealth, but also human capital, which is particularly important. To be honest, I've been focusing on one particular literature, partly because that's one of, we could be here all night and tomorrow as well. That'd be fun, but to narrow the scope of the talk, focusing on that. But yes, very good point. Thank you for reminding us that it's not just income, it is also wealth that matters. And of course, other sociologists in the room would remind us that it's not, there are issues of power and other sorts of things that are associated with income and wealth, or with occupation, but there is all wider measures of social position than the relatively narrow ones that I've been talking about. Indeed, one of the lessons that I was trying to get across by reminding you of what is to remind you of what the headline measures are actually based on. We all think of these wider concepts, but in fact they're based on relatively narrow ones. So your point is a very good one. Thank you for it.
Buonasera.
Buonasera.
Si sente? La ringrazio per questa lezione molto...
Thank you so much for this very clear lecture on how to read data. And I hope it's not offensive to make a question about the causes, because today there is a lot of literature on data, but then we economists are not ready to give answers. So it's fashionable at the time to say that everything is caused by institutions, but then it's not clear what institutions are. Now, the data that you showed demonstrate that the US and Sweden, on the one hand, had the same results, but then UK and Italy had the same results. But these are countries, where instinctively there are very different institutions, if we think of the welfare state, for example. So I wonder if, in your opinion, whether the welfare state matters, and what is the theory which can explain us why the welfare state is so important in building up social mobility?
How long have I got? So, big question, very big question, but you warned it. I mean, yes, there are clearly differences across these countries, and it's easier to talk about the Nordic countries compared to other countries like Italy or the UK or the US, because they're very different welfare states. And one of the things, well, let's take an example. We've been talking about the promotion of family policies as one way of improving social mobility, equality of opportunity, and so on. And maybe it is that if depending on how you define the welfare state, if you think about the Nordic welfare states, that it is rather broader than it is in many other countries. And I think that sounds like a rather banal statement, but I think it begins to get to the heart of what we're at. And so the moves that I reported for the Blair government and the later Brown governments about putting resources towards families, helping families generally into the labour market, the so-called early years policies are a move that might be interpreted as in the Nordic direction and help, will have these longer-term payoffs. And at the other end, the villain of the piece, countries like the USA, simply don't have these policies in the same sort of way. So the nature of at that level, where when you're talking about welfare states in a very general sort of way, I think it's there is a fairly easy answer to it. The difficulty, of course, is, as I've been saying in my talk, the devil is in the details, and they become important. So. As I was emphasizing before, choices matter, and related, what that also means in the policy arena is that policies matter, and there are different policy regimes that countries can choose or have chosen, and they will lead to different outcomes. But of course, there are other sorts of things going on. It's the nature of the labour markets, in particular, the nature of the education system. But of course, that brings us back to governments again, and they're things that governments and who are influenced by the electorate can ultimately make choices about and change directions. It's a bit like an oil tanker. It takes 10 kilometers to change the direction. But, things can happen in the longer term. And I think, let's hope it does.
Allora, speriamo che questa petroliera riesca a virare anche nel nostro caso.
So let's hope that this oil tanker can also sail towards us. Anyway, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much, everybody. Grazie mille.